Hello, guys. I hope everyone is doing very well today or tonight, wherever you are. I'm supposed to be doing a lot of other things, but of course, I had to stop and make a video because something came to mind I kind of wanted to talk about before the idea got away from me. This is the dynamic in which the narcissistic or abusive person causes a lot of trouble and chaos in your world, and then they turn to you when you try to address it and say that something's wrong, and they say, well, I'm perfectly happy. What's wrong with you? Right? And of course, this can be very gaslighting. Now, some narcissists would never say, I'm happy. They would lash out at you or something. But there is a situation where the narcissist acts like you're making a big deal, like something's wrong, and I'm fine. Nothing's wrong with me. And even if there is a more abusive situation, sometimes a narcissist will act like this anyway. An abusive person, a pathological person, they will express and even seem to be happy, well-adjusted, and balanced in the dynamic at times and say, I'm doing pretty good. I'm happy. I'm glad where things are. I don't know what you're talking about. Why are you so upset? Why is something wrong? Of course, if you look at the immediate situation, a lot of times it's obvious that they caused a scene and they just don't care. But I think a lot of times this happens in the situation where the abuse is more covert. I had an abuse situation one time that I came to designate as what I call covert oppositional defiance because of the amount of non-cooperation and foot dragging, as I called it, but it was always done very slyly and carefully, and this isn't a problem. Supposedly this is not a problem. What are you talking about? It's not that big of a deal. You know, you're making too big of a deal out of something that's normal. And a lot of times that these people are used to dragging their feet around and they have developed a lifetime of ignoring it or excusing it away, then that is not even necessarily about you as much as it is about their continual excusing away. But back to they're happy with the way things are. And of course, this once more is all about the narcissist and not about us, as far as they can be very dysfunctional and they've lived to find some kind of degree of acceptance of the situation. And this has a lot to do with avoiding reality. That's a lot of times why you hear people complain of their reality being twisted and gaslighting, is because that's what the narcissist routinely does with their reality, is ignore and twist it. And they have to keep doing that, or else they have to face a crisis of the truth and reality. And so what you're facing when they turn to you and say nothing's wrong is you're facing their false ego, their false world, their what the psychologists refer to as their preoccupation or fantasy. Because even the psychologists define it as a continual fantasy with the extremes and with the ideal. Where the narcissist even gets the whole concept of idealizing things is they try to live in an ideal that's not reality. And so the reason why that they are so-called well-adjusted in a horrible environment is very simply you're living more in the light of the truth, and they're living more in darkness. They're not in reality, which if the narcissist spoke the truth, they would say, I'm not happy either. They wouldn't say, why are you upset and unhappy? I'm perfectly happy. The truth of that, the flip side of what they're saying, which is a lot closer to the truth, is they would tell you, I see that you're not happy, and guess what? I'm not happy either, because I'm having to always escape into fantasy. The truth be known is they're not happy with reality either, or they would not constantly adjust and appear so well adjusted by constantly escaping from the same reality that you're also upset with. And they may be not okay with reality for completely different reasons than you, and they likely are, because they're not okay with reality, because if they ever tried to walk in reality for more than 15 minutes, they would have to come to a realization and an understanding that they've been living a huge lie, what all they've done to people. They aren't this super godlike on a pedestal person that they think they are. Their life is a mess. They have a lot of work to do and a lot of apologies to give. And so, no, it is one big huge lie when they say that they're happy and well adjusted or when they behave that way. You're the one in reality. They're the one escaping that same reality that you have a problem with, and they're not speaking the truth. And so they say, I'm fine, I'm happy. Guys, the reason I'm making this video is I have had relationship dynamics with people who are doing exactly this. And they would do these things in such a covert manner that I didn't really see it until I got away from it. Like, I had suspicions and peaks when I was with them, but when I got away from it, I was like, bingo, that has got to be what they were doing. And so, when they appear cool, calm, collected, well-adjusted, while you're over there understandably in pieces and frazzled, to put it mildly, it's because they are building a false world around them that is exactly what they like. And when something comes along that they don't like, boom, they're in that false world to such a depth and degree that the reason you're in their life is to constantly bail them out. You probably don't realize it, but you're constantly the one who is making life possible for them at the level that it is, whether or not it's a stability level or a financial level. You're the one making that possible because you're the adult. You're actually taking care of things. If it wasn't for somebody like you there, they would have a serious problem. That is how dysfunctional they are many times. Of course, I mean, this varies in different situations because sometimes the narcissist can pull it together enough to hold down a job, but they will be a same walking disaster on the job as well. But many times, a person that's living in this degree of fantasy, some part of their life would completely collapse without the supply. I was just using like bill paying as one example, but there's many levels of irresponsibility that they can fall through on. And so many times they're escaping. It's a constant escape, whether it's drugs, alcohol, fantasy, addictions of one kind or another. They are only truly so-called well-adjusted due to this constant escape. They're not comfortable and okay with reality the way it is either. But they'll gaslight you into, I'm fine, I'm able to keep it together. I'm able to seem apparently happy and upbeat. So what is your problem? What is your issue? And as I've pointed out in many of other videos, I do highly suspect that these people rely a lot on a fantasy world of some kind or another, to some degree or other, especially if there is an addiction, especially a chemical addiction. And a lot of them don't need this. The ones that get really devil possessed, you can kind of see in their eyes how crazy they get. They don't even need a drug. And for some people, the littlest thing that they even need as a drug would be like caffeine. Little small things we wouldn't think of as drug, maybe even sugar. Because it's kind of like dealing with a small child. You wouldn't give a really small child that hasn't learned how to, have both of their feet on the ground in reality and not run around screaming all the time. When they're at that age where they're running around just screaming and excited, everything, the last thing you give them is sugar and caffeine. It's kind of like the same concept with these older people that have either they've never been disciplined or they've reverted back to not being disciplined. Lots of different reasons there. But I've seen these people, in order to compensate, in order to have their own stability, they live in a fantasy, and it's strange. And I've brought this up in several of my other videos, and I have some more details to share here. I guess I've been thinking about the ones that I know of that did this little mechanism, this little covert, sly-handed thing where they said, I'm fine. What are you having a problem about? And at first, and guys, for like a long time, as you probably already know how bad the gaslighting can be, how tricky it can be, but it took a long time to outright catch people in lies, and these are people that I did not want to think were lying. Did not ever usually lie, but they lied. The ones that I know of, now some narcissists, I mean, they lie about everything, so it's kind of easy to see that that's the way they are. The ones I'm thinking of, they really did not lie until they really had to cover. And they would always lie when I was confronting them about what they were doing in their head, which typically is none of my business. Until you're abusing me at a certain level, it's none of my business. But yeah, when the abuse is this bad, I will confront you. Things like, are things attacking you at night and tempting you and seducing you away into some kind of a spiritual world? This is where I get with people, because I believe this happens very commonly. And by the time a relationship is so damaging and horrible and just outright damaging and cursed. There are bad spiritual things going on that many people don't ever address. And if you're trying to keep me in a relationship and not let me go and spiritually force me to be with you, but you're being this damaging to me, then I'm going to start asking you, are things coming to you at night when you're trying to sleep? Are they trying to seduce you? Are they trying to get inside of you, lead you away, take some kind of hold and bondage on you? Do you fantasize obsessively? Are you always in outer space with the demon aliens or whatever up there with them? You know, these are spiritual things that happen, the prince and power of the air. And it is a spiritual battle. So, yeah, if something's coming and trying to take over my whole life and ruin my life, I'm going to start asking questions. I'm going to start asking weird questions. I mean, if it was obviously drugs involved, then I could point to it and say exactly what the addiction and the bondage was. But when there's no drugs laying around, then I'm going to start asking, you know, what do you fantasize about? How often do you fantasize? What are you thinking? Why are you caught up and obsessed with all this? And either most people don't ever go there, they don't think it's that big a deal, or they don't even dream that somebody's doing this, or they think, well, if somebody does like to fantasize a lot, it's not that big a deal, because our entire culture is like saturated in fantasy-based escapisms, movies, TV, so it's not that big a deal, right? And I would argue it is a huge deal. It's an epidemic like drugs, and it causes a lot of bad things. A lot of bad things, not just narcissistic abuse. And so I don't mind asking these questions, especially if we're dealing with years of abuse. I'll start asking all sorts of strange questions and make you extremely uncomfortable. But that's when the lying happens, is when you confront them about this. And this is also why some of the people don't want to go to therapy, is they really have to start facing what's wrong. They have to start facing their weird, strange, and evil coping mechanisms. And they have to actually, the worst of the worst is they have to admit that what they think about themselves and what they want to think about themselves is not reality. It's kind of like threatening someone to take away their heroin cold turkey. That's why some of these people will not go to a therapist at all, is they know they can feel in their gut taking a step toward the door of the therapist might be too high of a percentage of a chance that they're going to have to actually open that door and let the light in. And so that's a very threatening thing for them. And even the ones that will play along and go, you can expect a lot of misleading, manipulation. So some signs that people are way out there and into some kind of a weird, into demon land and falsehoods and fakery in their mind. There is a degree of privacy. Like I say, you give people a degree of privacy of what they're having to do to cope and their path and their growth until they start violently abusing you. And the violence can even be very covert and nonverbal, non-physical. But when the abuse picks up, then it's time to get very judgmental and critical. It's time. Some signs I've seen in my abusers that they were in a fantasy, just foolishly. It's really a form of being drunk. And it's great. Once more, I go right to the source, the Holy Bible. The Bible explains this type of living. It's an irresponsible lifestyle. It is wasteful, especially, when done too much. That people do have a growing process and growing up. They should have the adulting arc or something. But the Bible describes these principles that I'm talking about, probably the most detailed and specific that I've ever seen anywhere. It mentions vain imaginations of the heart repeatedly and the damage that leads to and the wickedness that it leads to. And it talks about things like being drunk, walking in the darkness, when it spells out works of the flesh like the chambering and wantonness and different forms of drunkenness. It's like that comes from this state of the vain imagination, the not walking in reality, the not being disciplined. And a lot of this has to do with the foolishly, the fantasizing, and all of this. A lot of this has to do with childishness, refusing to mature, refusing to take on responsibilities, refusing to be engaged in reality and make adult commitments, and being engaged into fantasies and other forms of escapism. But the ways that I've seen people practice this, and it's funny, this is how I come to this conclusion, guys, by the way. Whenever I would be with these people, and first I would realize something's off base, something's wrong, something's not right. And whenever it finally got to the stage where, I mean, I had like tried to find everything in the world I could think of that was wrong, right? Whenever I started pinpointing it down to demonic and spiritual and oppression and fantasizing and just not being with both feet on the ground on planet Earth, which is really funny because I came to this conclusion about 5 to 7 years before I started realizing that this is what leads a lot of people toward narcissism. This is probably one of the key pillars that helps a person over their lifetime become the narcissist, is this fantasy. And of course, it's one of these 9 traits that the psychologists have identified, that these people are constantly obsessed with fantasizing about an idealistic state, whether that is this idea of fantasies about romance, status, power, wealth, beauty, and on and on. Well, this is exactly the conclusion I had come to a while back just from having to watch someone and be abused by them and not understand. And I'm going to give several points here of the different ways that different little hints you can have that someone is repeatedly and habitually doing this. But the overall concept is that their behavior does not match the real world. And you can't quite put it together of why did they just do this? And it doesn't have to be something rude or ugly. It's just strange. Why did they just do that? That makes no sense. I don't understand when they do that thing or this thing. And so one of the signs I believe I have seen is over-exaggerated behavior compared to reality. Over-exaggerated behavior would be talking louder than necessary. And I'm talking about someone who normally doesn't talk loud. That's not like their behavior from the family they were raised in or something. But they usually have the normal voice, but then there's these times where they get a really loud voice, and it has nothing to do with drinking necessarily. But boy, they get this really loud voice. Their demeanors may be exaggerated. Their motions and their movements may be exaggerated. And like when they walk, sometimes they'll thump their feet, just kind of thump, thump, and swagger from side to side, thump, thump, thump. And I think that's overcompensating. It's one of the things they do that is kind of like the bullying method that they will put on you, of having to force their reality into the real world, because the true reality is overwhelming. So whether it's talking or moving even or walking, they have to do it a little bit louder and bigger and more exaggerated because they're having to overcome reality and block it out. And they want their inner world to be bigger than the outer world, if you want to look at it from the narcissist perspective. Another thing I've noticed is that the behavior and the speech is not completely related to the reality around you at the time. And an example I have of this would be, I have a few examples that I remember very vividly that I did not understand until years later. And it's so funny because when it first happened, me and the person that was with me at the time were so mad about what happened that my instant gut reaction was, it's like they were living in some kind of a fantasy, and they were treating us like we were in the fantasy, and they were mad at us because we weren't in that fantasy with them, playing the game with them. And they were so in their head and in this fantasy world that when we were just being normal, they went off on us because we weren't in the fantasy with them. So their behavior and the speech is not completely related to reality. An example that I had there is that the person becomes angry, irritated. Irritated is the better word. They become excessively irritated and arrogant and condescending toward you, toward your normal, happy, carefree behavior, because it does not coincide with their very important daydream. And so the situation was, myself and a friend were with the friend who was daydreaming, and we were all traveling together, and all three of us were kind of together going along, and myself and the friend who was not daydreaming saw some strangers, and some music was playing, and we saw a few people that were like strangers, and we were all together in a group in broad daylight, so it was completely safe. And myself and the friend who wasn't daydreaming were pretending like we were, kind of like snapping our fingers and moving to the music. Well, the people who, the strangers that we saw were pretending like we're suddenly, and I guess what made it funny to us is it was slightly undignified, and they were complete strangers who just dropped their guard and became undignified, and it was all just funny. The strangers, and it was obviously not flirting or anything like that, because it was just not. It was just a funny, free moment, carefree moment, and kind of like adventurous. The guys who were strangers started pretending like one of them was pretending like they were playing a saxophone, the other one like they were playing the keyboard, and they were dead serious about it, and it didn't, the little episode probably didn't last any more than like 5 or 10 seconds, but they played their music and we were snapping our fingers. We started it, and then they started playing the music, and we all just kind of laughed and went our separate ways, and we would have forgotten about it, because it wasn't even that big of a deal. But the one who was daydreaming, kind of this is a person that doesn't rage and explode. They're more covert, but they went off on us about how that was not appropriate. That's not what you're supposed to do. You shouldn't act that way. You shouldn't act that way in public. That's so inappropriate. And at first glance, I guess what that would look like at a first glance is that they weren't in on the fun, and they were being resentful about it, and were trying to make up for the fact that they weren't in on the fun, and be like, well, the reason I didn't do that is because I'm more dignified, for example. But the problem is, this person wasn't usually petty in that way. And it was just so strange. It's hard to even explain what happened, but it was so strange for their behavior and for the circumstance. For example, when myself and the normal friend just kind of laughed and said, don't worry about it, it's over with anyway, well, let's just carry on and not make such a big deal out of it. The daydreaming friend refused to drop it. And they also had strange mannerisms when they did too. Their eyes got strange. Their behavior was the over-exaggerated behavior, like I mentioned earlier. And they were just like, oh, and very arrogant about it, like a strange kind of arrogance, like super aloof, and just, I'm not like that. And so, of course, me and the friend who weren't daydreaming, we just kind of changed the subject, and as soon as we realized that this was not going anywhere. But looking back on it, we had to talk about that because it was that was rude. What the daydreaming friend did was very rude. And the conclusion that I came to immediately on the spot, just to try to come up with something, and I didn't even believe it until years later. I was like, I bet you that is exactly what was going on. The conclusion I came to was, it's like they were in some kind of a deep fantasy for hours. And they were like, this person thought that they were, this person kind of tried to think of themselves as super proper and up there and uppity and better than that anyway, but they usually didn't make that forceful of a deal about it. But you add in the little extra of they're deep in some kind of a weird fantasy and really into themselves in this fantasy. Like, that's the narcissistic fantasies. You're really into yourself. You're into the whole. There was some kind of fantasy that they were having that our normal day-to-day, not that big of a deal, at least not to make that big a deal of it. I can understand just making a comment about make sure we stay together and make sure those people don't follow us, or I just had a weird feeling from them people. But that wasn't the communication. The communication was how wrong we were for having a carefree moment. And it was so off touch with reality and rude and disrespectful. Because another thing, just a quick little rabbit trail here, another thing that happens when these people live in the fantasy like this, I believe that they are strangely cursed. Their relationships are cursed. Things are strange. Things don't work out. Job situations don't work out well. Friendships don't work out well. They go around sabotaging themselves, which may drive them further into fantasy. And a conclusion I've come to with that is it's not blessable. God wants to bless people, but it's kind of like God would be repulsed by things like pride and things like not walking in the light of the truth. And God just simply will not bless that. He just will not bless somebody that refuses, that is constantly childish, immature, and hurting other people. It's like God blesses everyone, but if you notice, He's not going to just pour out blessings. It's just like some people would call it karma, because it's just such a known concept of reaping and sowing and the way things work. These people are not blessed in certain ways. They're not blessed in the ways that a person generally would be blessed who is having a certain degree of responsibility in their life. I think I'm old enough to have had a lot of different dealings and experiences with different people, and there's different reasons why people will just have a strange lack of blessing on their life. And that has been a good, strong warning to me a lot of times, and other people I've worked with, that sometimes in business dealings we'll be working with certain people and we'll be like, you know what? In life generally, the things we're working on find a way to come together, and it just works out. And if people are even, I'm not even talking about even saved people, just people who are being responsible and taking care of their children properly. Anybody, they don't even necessarily have to be saved for the kind of blessing I'm talking about, because it's just the way the world works. And so we would say, you know what, something's not right here. Either this is not supposed to happen for one reason or another, or these people don't have something together and they're lying to us, and that's not the real reason they're doing something. It's just, there is something called unblessable, irresponsible, drunk, not being in reality, not walking in the light of the truth, and it doesn't get blessed, it gets cursed at different levels. Some are more obvious than others. But back to our little situation here. At the time, I told my friend, back when we talked about it, saying that was the weirdest, rudest thing. I said, it's kind of like he's in his head, like he's way deep, deep in his head. And our innocence and fun irritated his stupid fantasy, his arrogant, stupid fantasy. And another thing is, God might have been showing us, knocking on our door, showing us, this is what your buddy really does. This is what they're like. But, because that happens too. God has a way of what's in the darkness coming to light, right? And another reason why people use this escape mechanism sometimes, I think maybe, is it's not as obvious as a wine bottle. So, and they think it's more innocent than the drugs, less expensive and everything like that. But at the time, that's the only thing I could throw out there, because I was like, it was so stupid and weird. But I was like, surely not, because surely, somebody wouldn't go that far. But sure enough, later on, I really think the person did have the problems, and that's how crazy. Like, for example, if somebody was just like in a normal daydream and it made them irritated the way they act, they probably would have dropped it as soon as we together came and made a lighthearted defense of, it's okay, let's just drop it, not that big a deal. But when someone refuses to drop it, and they are dedicated to that fantasy, when they refuse to drop it and go on, they're dedicated to some kind of a weird daydream. And it might be like the narcissist theory, a pet daydream. It's like, that's when I believe that an evil spirit has someone in bondage, is when they hold to that pet fantasy daydream so deeply that real world friends having a normal, decent time, if they come along and threaten your fantasy, you're going to stand up and defend that fantasy even when you look rude and strange at that level. Something's wrong. That's wrong. But it's a good example for you guys of some different things people might be doing. They're over-exaggerated talking, behavior and mannerisms, and like thumping their feet when they walk, and acting drunk. Sometimes they will literally act drunk. Like, yeah, and laughing, and it's like nothing's there to laugh at, but you're kind of like drunk and out of your head and weird. And then when somebody else, like if you get in real serious mode, because you think about what the psychiatrists spell out for these narcissistic fantasies, and you talk about narcissistic injury. It might have been a mild narcissistic injury would be the way to define what our friend was doing whenever they would not stop defending, to the point where they looked ridiculous. They would not stop defending their little condescending toward our fun. It was a narcissistic injury. We injured their daydream. That would be the typical, stereotypical definition of interrupting someone's false ego. And sometimes we think, well, surely not, because like if we were in a daydream, we would know that that's a daydream, and it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But the narcissist takes the false so seriously. Like for us, it might just be a natural thing our mind does, that an imagination even that God gave us to daydream or think about something sometime, and probably usually about real world people and real world situations we're having to deal with to try to figure out a problem. But that's, the narcissist is like, they have a whole other life that is dead serious to them. And if you challenge it in any way, they're injured. And that's the false ego, or it's called that. So one example of their behavior and speech not related to reality would be something like that. And I would just say one way to tell is, especially hopefully you'll be given more than one example so it'll become more obvious and other people will see it too, is that whenever they are being angry, arrogant, condescending, and rude to you about your normal behavior, and they won't let it go. They're defending something that you can't see. Things like that. When somebody starts getting really strange and rude and it don't make sense, back to the idea of it not jiving with reality. When it doesn't jive with reality, you have to do kind of like a backward analysis and say, wait a minute. And this is like something I don't even waste my time doing with people until they try to get too close to me. Then I'll do this. If you're repeatedly doing something that's not okay and not going to work and is abusive and crossing boundaries, then I'm going to analyze at this level. But instead of trying to figure out, okay, is this person's behavior coming from this or that, then automatically just go to, are they defending some kind of a false thing that is super important to them, even if it's as silly as what we would think of a daydream? Because some people apparently do that. I mean, it's defined in psychology. Even if they're having a pet fantasy that we have interrupted. Is that what they're defending to the point where they seem injured that you interrupted something as silly as a daydream? So, I think I said on another video of All Hat and No Cattle, one of those videos I think I talked about, it was funny one time where one of my friends interrupted her friend's silly fantasy. She poked her finger in the eye of his idol and set him off, and that's one way that she knew that he was actually idealizing something foolishly that was not that big a deal and had nothing to do with reality. That would maybe be one way to see this. If they start acting really ridiculous and you can't make any sense of it, something that does not make sense with reality, it's kind of like it may help to start asking yourself, are they defending something that's not there, something that they imagine is there, whether it's a daydream or another kind of a false belief system that's put in their mind from even like a form of insanity. Maybe they're defending something that's not there, or they're just living like in another world that you have interrupted and you don't realize how rude that is because you're in the real world. So strangeness like that. Another strange one that I suspected was for the same reason, talking endlessly and breathlessly about irrelevant topics. And when somebody's that excited and happy and this and this and this and that and this happened and then they did this and they did that and then I went here and this happened. There's a certain way that somebody talks with an expectation that you think that they're going to tell you this for a reason, or you think that they're going to tell you this because they're going to tell you an interesting thing that happened or an amazing thing that they learned. Why would there be all this excitement about you explaining to me how you went to the grocery store and then you picked up bread and you picked up lettuce and then you thought about, well, I need to pick up some beans, and you weren't going to even pick up a shirt, but you happened to walk your buggy by this shirt rack and there was a cute shirt you liked and you thought, well, that's a good price, I want to get that shirt. I mean, it's okay if you tell me about your day and even to that detail, that's fine. What's strange is if they don't usually tell you about their day in detail, things like that, or if that's not the kind of things you guys ever talked about, or they're telling you in an excited way, like breathlessly, like, and then there was this and this, and I went there and I did this, and they never talk like that. It's strange when someone does not do drugs and you know they don't do drugs, but they're acting these kind of ways, guys. Anything that doesn't jive with reality, I mean, you might not could even very easily tie it back to any kind of an explanation, but this might be what's going on. Something like it. Just breathlessly going on and on and on. Well, then this, and then there was that, and then this and this, and I took the card up to the register, and then when I checked out, I walked to my car. I walked all the way in the parking lot to my car, and the sun was shining, and I'm like, and you got into a wreck? Or you met an old friend you hadn't seen in 15 years and it was interesting? Like, what was the point? I mean, I can even understand somebody telling me, highlights of their day or things that affected them and helping me understand. But when you're doing it like you're excited and or anything weird like that, guys, and strange, it's like something has got their mind. That's back to what I say, the devil's got their mind sometimes. So that would be an example of a behavior in a speech that's not related to reality. It doesn't make sense to you. It's out of the ordinary, especially if you've known them for a while and you know how things should go. Maybe you could call this red flags to not just write off flippantly. Another thing that was strange that I've seen a few different times is overplaying an illness. And of course, a lot of you guys, if you studied a lot of narcissist things, you might automatically say, well, that would be like the weak and the victim narcissist. But what I'm talking about is a person who wants to be capable and they want to be pretty strong and capable, but this is kind of a weird thing to describe, but I've seen it a lot. So I'm trying. Okay. They want to be capable and reasonable, and they don't want to be seen as crippled and I mean, they want to do the best they can, and if they really are sick, then they really are. But if they're not, then they don't want everybody to, they're not trying to play you constantly for money and attention and time all the time. But it's a strangeness like this. Okay, most people I know, and maybe it's just the family I grew up in, but most people I know, if they kind of like ram their leg into a chair or halfway trip over something, they're wanting to shake it off and move on pretty quickly as they can, and they're hoping that the pain was gone like a minute ago. They're hoping that there's not a lot of lingering pain. They're focused on other things. It was just an inconvenience that they hope that they can just shake off and move on. Shake off is the best description. Okay. But someone who is like living in a pet fantasy and that they're really kind of into it and weird about it, and I'm saying this because I've seen it a few different times. What can happen there is their pet fantasy does not necessarily, maybe for the victim narcissist, their pet fantasy is that they are on a sick bed and being waited on hand and foot, and they're willing to draw you into that fantasy and see what they can get from you. But this kind of a narcissist with their pet fantasy, their pet fantasy may not be primarily that they're sick and they're weak and they're weakly. But back to it, their life is not blessable to a large degree because they live in this wicked way, this drunk way. One of the silly things that I've seen happen when someone is just kind of not there is that sometimes, like from time to time, way more often than the person who's just trying to shake it off and get on with their life and get on with important things, get on with things that they're probably needing to do to get on with their day, cook supper, clean up a little bit, even check Facebook, whatever. But the person who bumps their leg that's in the pet fantasy, somehow or another that triggers them. Any little strange illness or injury that even some moderate injuries that a person just really wants to shake off and move on, and they're not trying to milk it for attention. Then the person that's already in some kind of a weird fantasy, it's kind of like one of the hooks for them. I guess it would be about attention at that level. Their main attention is not sickness. But as soon as a convenient little sickness comes along, they milk it. They sit there and they milk it. And it can literally make them sicker and it can hurt them. But it's kind of like their primary focus is not on, oh, how sick I am and how much I need all of your attention and all of your resources. But when it comes up and it's convenient, they milk it. And it's more, the people I've seen it in, it's more about attention and it reinforcing their fantasy in a powerful way, because back to the idea that they want their reality to be louder and to drown out the truth. Well, here comes a little twinge in their back or in their side, and they're like, oh. And they'll put their hand on it and they'll just lean forward and they'll look at you like, a twinge in my back. And you're just looking at them like, stand up straighter and get over it. Snap out of it. It takes 5 seconds. We all get twinges. It's irritating, it's annoying, it's weird, and it's rude. And if you've ever seen it, you probably know what I'm talking about. If you've never seen it, you're probably like, what on earth? And I don't blame you. But I'm just saying that in case you see it. It's things like that, guys. That's what they do. They sit there and they'll milk it until they see that you're not buying into the crap. And then they'll kind of back off. But still in their mind, I think they're still playing this fantasy. Somehow it feeds their fantasy. It's the strangest thing. Maybe you could think of that like a somatic-based demon or something, some kind of a demonic oppression. I'm sorry, but I don't have words for some of this stuff, and I get very irritated at it. But that's one thing I can't stand, because sometimes I do step the wrong way, and I do bend the wrong way, and I'm like, oh, my back feels weird. I pray, and I hope. I pray and I hope that in a few minutes that I can just kind of stand up straighter and it'll go away. And sure enough, thank God it does. And I don't know if that's just part of aging. Does everybody have that? But it irritates me when somebody who is supposed to be strong and confident, they'll have that same little twinge and they'll milk it, for lack of a better concept. They'll milk it. They'll sit there and slowly put their hand to the area and they'll stay bent over and they'll look around to whoever's around and announce, oh, oh my goodness. Like with a helplessness and a hopelessness that it's never going to get any better. It's never going to go away. It give up. And also it's an attention seeking thing. And I believe it's reinforcing some kind of a weird, strange fantasy that they're addicted to. It's like, okay, you know what? Whatever was giving them attention in their fantasy, well, that's just one more reason to get more attention in their fantasy is now they've got a weird twinge in their back or something. And part of why I'm saying this is I have confronted these people before about fantasizing and thinking that they're cute. And I literally told them verbatim, the devil has got you thinking that you're cute when you do XYZ. That's what that is. The enemy is playing with your mind in a fantasy, and it has you looking bad. It has you looking wrong and bad and inappropriate to everyone around you, saying, what's wrong? Why did they do this? Why did they do that? And not understanding, and it's because what you're reacting to is your fantasy. It's like a complex that people get into, and it's either a disease or something like an evil spirit or both. But it's a complex that people get into that if they follow the feelings and the emotions and the thoughts that the evil or the sickness gives them, it doesn't work for them. It doesn't work well. And that's how that dynamic works. I've just seen it enough. And I've confronted people whenever it's irritating enough and I just want to slap them and say, that's stop, just stop. I'll do that, unfortunately, I guess. But I have told people, I think what's happening is you're caught up in a complex in your head. And something is telling you that you're very cute and very special. And so whenever you react to that very cute, very special signal, you do things that are irritating people, that are hurting you, that are not productive. And the deception is you think and you feel that you're very cute and very special. And guys, this is why I can't separate it. This is why I cannot separate it from the spiritual, because this is how the enemy would work. It might just be a sickness for some people, but I suspect a lot of times this is the enemy, guys. I'm sorry. I suspect a lot of times that this is the enemy. That's how the enemy would work. But meantime, you're in very cute, very special land, and I'm sorry. And I have to mention again that this matches the psychologist's definition of what the narcissist is doing with the fantasy. I think a person can do this and not be a full-blown narcissist, but that's a problem area for them, is the fantasy issue. And so while you're caught up in very cute, very special land, thinking that you're being cute and special, in the meantime, over here in reality land, you're harming yourself, you're harming other people, you're doing the opposite. But the reason I even brought this all up is I've told people this and confronted them with that, and they changed their behavior drastically from, to their credit, I guess, they changed their behavior from this strange thing that people thought was just them and part of them that they would never stop, to suddenly not doing it anymore because they identified it, or they realized how embarrassing that is, that other people can see, this weird, complex dynamic that's just counterproductive. And so whenever I see the changed behavior, I'm like, I wonder if they caught on to something and that maybe I told the truth. Maybe I was on to something and it was the truth. Either that or they stopped doing it because they're like, well, people are thinking if people are thinking all this, I'm going to stop. But maybe they changed because they just realized how irritating it was. But that's my theory, and it coincides with psychologists that I've never even met that are over here defining it as these people are living in some kind of a fantasy world that you better not confront. It's not just a daydream. You better not confront it or they will be narcissistically injured, because that is their reality, because they cannot cope with reality. But that's one of the strange ones, is overplaying an illness. Not all the time, not constantly, but when one conveniently comes up, it's a part of the cute fantasy. And it took me years, guys, to put my finger on this and say that is what's happening. I can't see it. It's because we can't see it. But I just decided that's what it is, because it's ridiculous and it's too many coincidences. But my theory on all that is that these people are hooked with their feelings from an early age. And it could have a lot to do with child abuse or traumas that happen early that don't give a person like a real investment in reality. And so they're looking for these overcompensations and these defense mechanisms. And so they slip into fantasy and maybe they become trapped there or something. But I believe that what their fantasy is giving them, especially when compared to the psychologist definitions, It's giving them stimulation. It can give them this intensely pleasant emotion, peace, joy, love, acceptance, and not the kind of peace, joy, and love that God gives you, but like a fake drunk kind of peace, joy, love. I believe in their fantasies they're getting attention and praise, and it can be something that they get addicted to. So of course that's why they keep going back. Attention, praise, purpose. Goes back to my theory that there's these powerful neurochemicals in people's brain that they're feeding on. If they can live in an alternate reality where they're constantly bombarding their brain with pleasant chemicals, then they may get addicted to that. That's their state. That's where they live. But they feel like they belong there. They can't do anything wrong there. They're safe there. And there can be pleasure, attention, and praise. And of course, I bring out that this comes with subtraction. It's not blessable. It's a drunken state. It's not sowing into reality, and they're not going to reap rewards. It's not responsible. And what happens with the relationship dynamic is that whenever they have to deal with the unpleasantness of what they have created into reality, the way they deal with it is they just go off into fantasy again and start a whole nother cycle of sowing bad, rotten seeds. Meanwhile, if you're part of their intimate life, you're also reaping those terrible bad seeds, right? But you don't go and escape into fantasy. And so what happens there is you're the one, I mean, it's typical, the same with any kind of like narcissistic abuse. You're the one who is representing reality, and so you're the one who looks like something is off kilter. Whereas they're relying on the unhealthy coping mechanisms that's causing all the problem, and they can appear oftentimes more stable and calm and mature, like they've got things all together when they're the ones dropping the nasty seeds everywhere. And so, if they're like a covert style of doing this, they'll start looking down on you, being arrogant, prideful, disdaining you. It reinforces their false reality. They start even believing to themselves that you're the problem. You're the one who has something wrong. You're the one over-exaggerating. You're the nag. You're the witch. They're smug toward you and condescending. And they are self-reinforced that they are right. And they have chosen the right, peaceful way. Maybe even the godly way. And you're the one who is apparently disobeying God or not being submissive enough or meek enough or godly enough because you are off kilter, when really if you would just get away from them, you would be perfectly fine. So you're the one disturbed by the abuse, understandably. You're the one that is stressed out and beaten and violated. And they're the one calm and living in their comfortable, cushioned, air-conditioned little bubble of fantasy. So when they tell you, I'm happy, I'm fine, they're not, or they would be in reality with you. They're not. They're retreating back to their little bubble. That's not happy. That's not okay. And that's not fine. They're not fine. You're way better off than them in that case. And so, another tip on that for the dynamic part is that this can also be very misleading to outsiders, misleading to people who've never experienced this before and don't know what they're dealing with. Because you look like the one with the complaint, and this includes counselors. Go to the counselors. You're the one with the anxiety disorder. They're the one who is the only adult in the room. That's how it can appear, so be careful. So that's all I have today. I hope this was interesting, helpful, and informative, as difficult as some of this was to explain. This is verbatim what I have witnessed, and I believe there's really something to it. That's what I have on this covert narcissistic abuse, where they're perfectly fine in their bubble while they're destroying your life and blaming you for it. But I do wish you guys a lot of success and blessing in your healing journey, and I will see you soon on my next video.